After completing parts 1 and 2 on this topic, part 3 will be for a slight correction with some important clarification on that correction based upon what I've stated in parts 1 and 2. And also, secondly, I'll address briefly the Babylonian zodiac. What is the Babylonian zodiac? Well, first of all, there's only 12 star constellations in the Babylonian zodiac, and it divides the year, the solar year, into 12 equal parts. There's never a 13th star constellation in the zodiac. However, the Babylonian calendar itself, since 499 BCE, sometimes intercalated a 13th month without a 13th star constellation, which makes it obvious, it should be therefore, that the zodiac was not utilized for the beginning of months or years. According to the Babylonians, since 499 BCE, as proven explicitly in ancient archaeology and by ancient astronomy scholars, as I pointed out in part 2 of this video topic. And so, however, though, I'd like to also state that over 2,000 years ago, there was not much difference between that as there is today regarding and because of the procession of the equinoxes. As I believe I stated briefly, is that these star constellations in the Babylonian zodiac are drifting. The star constellations are drifting based from the equinoxes themselves every 70 years approximately, one full day. So you do the math, for about 2,000 years ago you're looking at about 28 days, which is a whole month different than it was today versus about 2,000 years ago. Or if you go back to the time of Moses, we say Moshe, you have 49 days approximately difference that these star constellations, when you're looking up and seeing them in the sky at a different time of the year compared to today. And so it's important to realize that today there's a lot more of a difference. So if you're utilizing the Babylonian zodiac to determine your seasons of biblical feasts, it's going to be different. However, the moon and the sun haven't changed like that in their position of timing in cycles astronomically. Therefore, what I propose is that our Creator designed the precession of the equinoxes to encourage sincere, non-biased truth seekers to not intermingle the zodiac signs with the timing of the Moedim regarding the Torah biblical sacred calendar. And I'm going to touch upon that later on in this video teaching, and I'm just giving you a little heads up. This is going to be a little bit longer video teaching perhaps, but first of all I want to get to the slight correction based upon something I've stated in parts 1 and 2 of this topic. And let me give you what I stated in, quote, wording it here exactly. I said, notice scriptures in the Tanakh with Babylonian month names, and I stated none were written before 499 BCE. And there's the list of the 7 of those. But, well, shortly after that, part 1 and 2, Herb Selinsky, he watched it and he contacted me privately and stated, wow, that even he was slightly wrong in that. He didn't realize that Zechariah was one of that, or at least I didn't actually double check on Zechariah. It's obvious Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah was written post-Babylonian exile and the Babylonians' influence, but that the book of Zechariah was written about 519 to 520 BCE. And there's the two scriptures you see in Zechariah chapter 1 verse 7 and chapter 7 verse 1. In 1 verse 7 you see that month. It says, on the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month of Shabbat, however you want to pronounce that, Shabbat or Shevat, in the second year of Darius. Notice it says this is the 11th month. And then also in Zechariah 7:1 it says, "Now in the 4th year of King Darius it came to pass that the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month." So here it says 9th month, and it's Kislev. And that's according, those quotes there on the New King James Version, as I usually quote from unless otherwise stated. Now, therefore, I did a little Google search on Zechariah to get some updated information on this book. Was it written? Was it revised at all since 520 BCE? And what is the dating of Zechariah's book? From the top few results online from the Google search engine, most modern scholars apparently agree that the first 8 chapters were written 419 to 420 BCE. Everyone seems to agree with that. While Zechariah was a young prophet. And then the following chapters 9 through 14 were most likely written much later by either Zechariah himself with a much different writing style during his older ages, or some scholars believe it was one of his disciples, or maybe a leading disciple of his, which I don't take that conclusion. But, if such be true, either case, or at least likely, as a lot of modern scholars believe, then such would explain why and when the Babylonian months' names were edited or inserted into the book of Zechariah since 499 BCE, or could have been, there's some overlap time, but this is based upon archaeology and when it was obvious that the Babylonians made a parallel shift in their calendar, which paralleled the Hebrew Torah biblical calendar. And so writing styles can change from younger to older ages. I know myself, with even the book I've published on Amazon, Creator's Sacred Calendar, I've made some changes in my view, and I've revised it over the last, since about 2001, when I first started writing, and based on my research that I was coming to conclusions with, and changing the timing of when I would keep these biblical feasts. And so I can see with myself and others, it's not unlikely or hard to believe that Zechariah would write the first 8 chapters and then later on in his ministry write with a little bit different writing style, and then insert these Babylonian month names once he realized that it was parallel, that the Babylonian months were parallel with the calendar that they were going by. So regarding the book of Zechariah, I'd like to just encourage you to check out some scholars yourself. For example, Bible.org website. It states that Zechariah began prophesying as a young man, while Haggai was an older prophet at the time, much older than Zechariah. And so there's some controversy, as you'll see in Bible.org, over who and when chapters 9 through 14 were written, and they're just presenting the scholarly approach, not being too dogmatic with either opinion. But Bible.org leans towards Zechariah writing those chapters later on in his ministry, and first written in 520 BCE, and then until much later in his ministry. You can see that, and as you scroll down, you'll see that even Baldwin and other scholars believe Zechariah wrote these chapters 9 through 14, but just simply much later in his ministry, and I believe, based on researching that, it looks like it's definitely, or at least probably, since 499 BCE, when the Babylonians made this change to parallel the Hebrew calendar, the biblical Torah calendar. So also notice the book of Zechariah, according to Charles or Chuck Swindoll. And I don't know if he's a swindler, but Charles, I don't know too much about his theology, but he presents this from a scholarly point of view as well, with no apparent bias behind or a motive behind it to be corrupt in any way that I can see. But he says that Zechariah's lifespan overlaps years with Haggai, as an older prophet, a mentor perhaps, for Zechariah, and also going into King Xerxes from when he was reigning from 485 to 465 BCE, and apparently he claims that's the king who married Esther, which would explain why Esther uses Babylonian month names since 499 BCE. And apparently Zechariah lived up until his time in his elderly years. And he also states that Zechariah's name is the same Zechariah that's in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, that perhaps he lived long enough to make it even until that time as a much older prophet, if that be the same Zechariah as expressed in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, as a Levite priest and a prophet. And that's a possibility. Just like King David was a king and a prophet, here Zechariah could have been a priest and a prophet. And that chapters 9 through 14 were completed according to what Chuck Swindoll expresses here in the 470s or 480s BCE. And then as a third source, I looked at the book of Zechariah according to GoQuestions.org. Not that they have all credibility on this topic, but at least they're expressing the majority of updated information from modern scholars, information that comes from archaeology that's discovered through time and scholarly opinions. And quoting them here, as you can see, the book of Zechariah was likely written in two primary segments between 520, or could have been as early as 519, as some scholars say, and up to 470 BCE, according to their research on this topic, which is probably more in depth than mine. And so simply representing, again, the majority of the latest research among credible scholarly opinions. So I just recommend everyone to do your own research on the book of Zechariah. Why would he include Babylonian months names regarding the timing? And it could have been revised later on. We can see with some research that even the book of Deuteronomy at the end, it's talking about the end of his life, written from someone else's perspective writing it, unless Moses himself is prophesying the details of when he's dying and afterwards. But most scholars agree that there was someone that had, probably a priest, had inserted a little bit of information at the end of Deuteronomy. And there's other issues in the Tanakh, which shows that there could have been some little touches here and there. A lot of speculation about the Masoretics too. But anyway, I don't want to get off on a different topic, and I'm not trying to establish too much dogma with scholarly information. That I am, not the type to do that, and from potentially ambiguous scholarly information as well, especially when it's ambiguous. But my research expresses, and it does offer, credible scholarly academic support. Let me just say support as to why Babylonian month names were written within the book of Zechariah, and not in other books written before 499 BCE, as far as I know. Okay, if you have something to disprove that or debunk what I'm saying, I'm always open for information, and that's why I have this correction. Is I admit it, I confess it, and especially if I teach something inaccurately, slightly, and even if it's slightly inaccurate, I want to correct it and make it good. And therefore, as a result of the diverse scholarly dating of Zechariah, it is most likely that it was revised. Zechariah's book did take place between 419 to the 470s BCE during his lifetime, I believe. So here is my revision. Here is my revision of why Babylonian month names were inspired within the Tanakh, to correct the point. Parts 1 and 2, when I gave you that. Let me give you a new one, and I'll start out with a question rather than just a statement. Before I give you the 7 different month names here, is why are the 7 Babylonian month names within the inspired Tanakh? Why are they? What we call the Old Testament. And there's a list for you again. And by the way, case you didn't notice, in point number 7, I had back in those video teachings Ezra 6 verse 5, and it should be Ezra 6:15. You'll find the month of Adar listed, not verse 5. So a little correction there too. And if you find any other typos, please let me know. Like I said, I'm open for correction, but you have to have good evidence for me to agree with you. Good evidence. As Herb Selinsky has been good at providing to me and giving me some corrections, and he's willing to admit when he's wrong and when there's good evidence as well. Therefore, regardless of Zechariah's ambiguous dating in chapters 9 through 14, the bigger picture here to focus towards is Ezra and Nehemiah utilizing Babylonian month names with absolute religious freedom that the Persian Empire, the Persian king, gave them. Tell them to rebuild the second temple as prophesied, Cyrus doing that, and restoring the written Torah, restoring the land and the people, and also cleansing the temple and dedicating the temple as the Torah said to do it, and the holy people, cleansing the people as well. And so, as Herb Selinsky also well stated and included within his writing on this topic, if you want to see it as well, in his most recent free PDF titled Beginning of the Biblical Year, his second edition, completed July 4th, 2018. That's just recently here from this recording. Chapter 13, bottom of page 20. He quotes Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 30. And I'm going to give you the New King James version. He quotes a different translation. But here it says, thus, Nehemiah saying, thus I cleansed them of everything pagan. I also assigned duties to the priests and the Levites, each to his service. So everything pagan, but he uses Babylonian month names. So is he a liar by using Babylonian month names? If that was wrong, if the Babylonians' months, the beginning of their months and their years were different than the sacred calendar of the written Torah, and that the Levites, that Moses and the Levites used ever since for the Moedim of the annual feasts? Well, as I pointed out in points in parts 1 and 2 on this topic, I believe that there's the two parallels of when the year and month begins. And let's remember that Nehemiah was inspired to utilize these three different, let me give you the three different months that he utilized of those 7 that are in the Tanakh. Here we have Nisan. Notice he doesn't use Abib or Aviv, either of those. He uses Nisan, the Babylonian month name. Check up on it. Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 1. And it says, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan, not Aviv or Abib, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. And then he uses Elul in Nehemiah chapter 6 verse 15. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And then Kislev in Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 1. The words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah, it came to pass in the month of Kislev in the 20th year. So there it goes for you. There is the list. But however, there is one verse where he doesn't use the Babylonian month names, and I find this interesting that we might want to apply to us today as well. There is one verse where he doesn't use it. Notice in Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 2, it says, so Ezra the priest brought the law, this is the written Torah, before the assembly of the men and women, and all who could hear with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. Now that's Yom Teruah, as we see in Leviticus chapter 23 verses 23 through 25, as modern Judaism calls Rosh Hashanah. It's actually Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Shouting, blowing shofars and shouting excitement, joy of something amazing and awesome to come in the future. And still prophetic of something, a shadow of things to come in the future. So, again, why would Nehemiah not utilize the Babylonian month name in here? That's a good question. Even though the Babylonian month timing, the monthly timing, was the same and interchangeable in those days. Was it just a matter of preference regarding biblical holy days not to utilize the names of the Babylonian, even though they were the same timing? Some might say, well, they were different timing, and that's why he didn't do it, and that might be an idea and that comes up. But as many people today, what I propose, just like today people say Shabbat, they prefer that. Believers will say Shabbat or Shabbos, the Ashkenazi pronunciation, or the English translation is Sabbath, rather than Friday night or Saturday. There's times when we say Friday night or Saturday because the timing is the same as the Sabbath. But this is why we see Babylonian month names. But also notice in verse 9 where Nehemiah says here, makes it very clear it's this holy day as well. In verse 9 he says, and Nehemiah, as we say in Hebrew, who was the governor, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, this day is holy unto Yah your Elohim. Do not mourn or weep, for all the people wept. Of course, not because they're so sad, but because they're so happy when they heard the words of the law. This is the written law. Tears of joy, not tears of sadness or burdensome or burdens. They were just happy, joyous. And read the context for yourself and you'll see. So, to connect the Babylonian month names again with the Torah biblical reckoning of months, as I've noticed, if you notice in the previous verses and that I've quoted, notice some of these verses also in Esther, where it says, so the king's scribes were called at that time in chapter 9, or chapter 8, verse 9, it says, in the third month. So here's connecting the third month, which is the month of Sivan. Making the connection here with the Babylonian month names, and the Torah biblical month is the third month. On the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai, righteous Mordecai, had commanded here. And of course using the Babylonian month names. So, and also, I would also like to express that I agree as Herb Selinsky's words in his PDF document, same document I listed before. He says here, and I quote, we understand how the ancient Babylonian calendar worked because of their eclipse records agree with modern computer simulation data for those eclipses. There are hundreds of eclipse records from ancient Babylon preserved on clay tablets between 747 BCE and the 1st century. Of course, he's referring to the 1st century CE. Continuing his quote, a little less than 200 of them also have the time of day based upon their water clocks. The Babylonians had these ancient, if I may say, sophisticated water clocks. Using computers and the formulas of astronomy to compute the time of those eclipses that were time-stamped by the ancient astronomers, the Babylonian astronomers. We know how the ancient Babylonian calendar worked. Interesting how this comes not until the 20th century, right? The end times, a restoration of the sacred calendar coming since the 20th century here into the 21st, as we call it today. Anyway, continuing Herb's quote here, he says, from 499 BCE until the Babylonian calendar's last record year of 75 CE, its first day of the month, the first month, did not begin before the vernal equinox. Now that's regardless of the zodiac signs. Again, the zodiac only had 12 signs in the year. There was never a 13th sign, but there was a 13th month within the Babylonian calendar. And by the way, Herb Selinsky also shows that 5 years during, if I remember right, during the time of Ezra, that century from 400 to 499 BC, he lists 5 times it happened on the spring equinox, or they wouldn't add a 13th month if it landed on the equinox. You can go back and look at that on his page there, as I provided in part 2 on this video teaching, and maybe I'll insert that here and correct that with an insert video here if I've stated that incorrectly. But moving on here, as Herb Selinsky proves within his other writings, as I've expressed in part 2 regarding the elite ancient, keyword is ancient astronomy scholars, not modern astronomy scholars as some people use, but ancient ones from the 1940s to the 1980s. Notice a recent publication from Sky and Telescope magazine, January 2018, from pages 66 to 71, expressing the origins of the Babylonian zodiac. But notice on page 67, very key here, and I quote here, the Sumero-Babylonian New Year began with its first visible evening crescent moon following the vernal equinox. And read that more in context for yourself. You can always push pause on the video here and read more that I've posted in here with visual aid. But moving on to pages 66 through 71, if you look at that and read that for yourself, you can Google search it, you can download it off the internet from Sky and Telescope magazine as I've done, or go to your library, and if your library has it, you can photocopy it. But you'll see that the Babylonians invented the zodiac. Not the Hebrews of the Bible, not the Egyptians before them, not the Greeks. The Greeks, before Alexander did not, according to the best scholars that we have up till today, from the 1940s up until today, with the research that's found, we can see that even though there were pictographic star constellations, they were recognized by humans long beforehand. These star constellations were up there. People were starting to connect dots and make pictures. I'm not saying that they weren't, but I'm talking about the zodiac and the zodiac signs. And but some people, some sincere believers, will go to Job, the book of Job, chapter 38. So let me address that a little bit as we move on to the end here. Job chapter 38, verse 32, they claim proves that the zodiac pre-existed the Babylonians. Well, when was the book of Job written? Now, Judaism has influenced Christianity, and so the older view was that it was written long before the Babylonians, but most modern scholars believe it was written between the 4th and 7th century BCE, anytime. So you're thinking 4th century, you got to realize that once you hit 300, you're entering the 4th century BCE, 4th century up until, like, say, 699, based upon what you can find out there. And for example here, how about the Haaretz magazine? You can see online here, I'll quote that, and just a portion of that. You can click on that, find that, and read it in more context. But they claim that the book of Job was written during the late 6th century BCE to the early 5th century BCE. And then, so that's the Haaretz, non-biased magazine in this regard, in regard to the calendar issue that we're talking about, and the Babylonian zodiac and the Babylonian month names, why they're in the Tanakh. They're not trying to address any of these issues. And also Wikipedia. Take a look at Wikipedia. Here they state that the book of Job was written between the 4th and 7th centuries BCE. And not that the Wikipedia is always right, but here again we have to look at that there's some ambiguous dating even with the book of Job. And I wouldn't want to base upon the holy calendar on something that's very ambiguous, such as the dating of the book of Job, or even say even the dating of the book of Zechariah, especially chapters 9 through 14, which is a little ambiguous. So regardless of when the book of Job was written, let's take a look at this quote here. Let's take a look at it a little bit more closely into Job 38, verses 31 through 33. It says, "Can you bind," this is our Creator speaking to Job, "can you bind the cluster of that star constellation there? And or loose the belt of Orion?" Verse 32, "Can you bring out the Mazzaroth?" as the King James translates it, and that's an ambiguous translation of them by itself, but regardless, let's say, for the sake of arguments, that's the Mazzaroth. "In its season." Notice that word season is not moed. Look up the Hebrew word yourself. If it was moed, that would give some of these Babylonian zodiac believers for the sacred calendar, that would give them some credibility, but it's not. It's the ayin, the tav, and the vav. However you want to pronounce that with the vowels, as they're not and weren't recorded back over 2,000 years ago. It's a completely different Hebrew word. It's not the moed. So the Mazzaroth is not, this isn't evidence that the Mazzaroth is used for moed. Let's continue on here regardless, as it says, "Or can you guide the bear, the great bear, with its cubs?" Another constellation, so a pictographic connecting dots in the sky. Verse 33, "Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth?" So yes, star constellations are mentioned in the Bible. I have no problem with that. I have no disagreement with that. But let's take a look here. Let's look at perhaps the constellations as hinted, as some propose in Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. There's no biblical or archaeological evidence of ancient ways to establish their role regarding exactly when days, months, and years are to begin. There's a lot of evidence to show this from the sun and the moon. The lunar solar calendar system can be proved, but not enough evidence, not any real evidence that I've found yet, or that I've seen from ancient archaeology or ancient astronomy scholars. The stars cannot determine exact set-apart dates or an exact day for a weekly or an annual Moedim, or the feasts of Yah, as we can with sunsets. And new moons happen on a specific day. And also the equinoxes could be determined on specific days, exact days. Regarding techufah, that's the Hebrew word, the tav. There you see the techufah, the Strong's number, Hebrew concordance number 8622. I'm going to cover that in a future video teaching in the near future. I don't want to go off on that too much, but just realizing that star constellations during specific feasts, as you might hear people propose that Aries must happen, the star constellation of Aries must be in the sky during Passover, or Gemini must be in the sky during Shavuot, or Libra. And there can be a lot of dogma behind that that's proposed by some people out there. But let's take a look at some of the zodiac star constellation origins from this Sky and Telescope magazine, January 2018. Again, I'll give you some inserts here that I've snapshotted from the PDF that I've downloaded here from pages 66 through 71. Notice page 69, Virgo, the Great Lady, Ishtar, also known as at a certain time. And then some people connect this to the virgin birth of our Messiah. And also on page 69, you can read there about the Gemini, the two great twins. These were nude, wild-haired brothers. And people connect this and say that it's Shavuot. It must be during the time of Shavuot that they'll call them the harvesting brothers. That's dangerous to do that, to connect that, if the Babylonians are the ones who invented this, according to even this magazine and all the greatest ancient astronomy and archaeology scholars. Page 71, jumping over there, the hired laborer. This was what later became, the Greek Romans called it the lamb, but the Babylonians called it the hired laborer, also known as the plowman. And Aries is what the Roman Greeks, they attributed to a ram. And so here's this connection. Is this a counterfeit? Is this a counterfeit that the adversary is trying to counterfeit the Creator and pull people away from the timing of our Creator's Holy Moedim or not? We need to have some more investigation on this. Where in the Torah and the ancient Hebrew archaeology can we find these things? Other than perhaps blending with idolatry. And then moving on, what do these actual zodiac star constellations look like? You know, if we're going to intermingle the zodiac with the Torah feasts, what do they look like? Let's look at them. Okay, Aries, which is also known as the plowman or the ram, depending on if you're a Babylonian or a Greek. And connecting that to Passover. Look at this. Just what is that? You know, just a couple stars. How do you get a ram out of that? It takes a lot of human imagination and artwork that's outside even connecting those dots. And then look at Gemini. You can see, okay, those are two people kind of hugging each other. The Babylonians considered the nude twin brothers or buddies. Here's a more, how about this more romantic view you can find online of Gemini and these two brothers hugging each other. And then also, well, let's just look at just from the sky. If you were to look up in the sky at the right time of the year and see Gemini, how do you get that? I mean, and then connecting that to Shavuot. Wow. And then moving on to Virgo. What does Virgo look like? The great lady, Ishtar. Okay, yeah, you can see the hips are bigger than the shoulders. Okay, that looks more feminine, like a female. The hourglass figure, it doesn't look so much like a man. I could see that by just connecting some dots. But look, there's no head. You have to imagine a head there out of nowhere, just a body. And this happens between August 23rd and September 22nd. Notice, just as it overlaps two different months of the Gregorian calendar, as the Greeks and the Romans did, to have the Julian calendar, now we go by the Gregorian calendar, the Babylonians did the same thing. Their months did not begin with the zodiac, 12 constellations, as they shifted into 12 equal parts of the solar year. And this is where there's some confusion and some misunderstanding in zodiac believers today, Torah observant zodiac believers. So, well, okay, how about Libra? Let's look at Libra here, the scales, or scorpion claws. Some people say, well, yeah, that looks like a house, or maybe a sukkah. With some really good imagination, you can see an altar there. How do you find an altar in that? Well, again, some good human imaginations and drawing things in the sky that are outside of connecting the dots. What I propose is human minds have great imaginations and love to intermingle idolatry with the Torah. And ancient Israelites were doing that, and beware. A lot of modern believers can be doing that as well. And let that be an Ezekiel 33 warning to those of you out there that might be doing that or starting to do that. I hope I'm not offending you. And if I'm wrong, please show me some good scholarly evidence. And having a doctorate's degree isn't good enough, right? People get a doctorate's degree and they specialize in something. I want to see a doctorate's degree specializing in ancient astronomy, a doctorate's degree in ancient archaeology, who can read the Akkadian language fluently, like Abraham Sachs and even Otto Neugebauer, and the other scholars I presented and exposed in my part 2 of this teaching. Just having a doctorate's degree or some special bachelor's or master's degree doesn't make you an expert in ancient astronomy or archaeology. So beware of that out there. Really check up on the scholarship. I found out that the scholarship in the lunar Sabbath people and the Babylonian zodiac believers, just they're bringing up scholarship, but it's got some flaws in it, some confusion in there that doesn't match up with the Torah, with the sacred calendar in every single way. It's good for approximate ways for the zodiac constellations, but not for determining the beginning of months or years. And then the lunar Sabbath people, they get off on the weekly Sabbath. That's another topic I don't want to get into. But let me remind you of Psalms chapter 104, verse 19. We don't see star constellations in here, but we do see, it says that our Creator, Yah, He appointed the moon for Moedim. That could be feasts, festivals. And it doesn't say all Moedim, like the lunar Sabbath people conclude. If it had the word all in there, that would give them some evidence for the weekly Sabbaths. But it says for Moedim, and the sun knows it's going down. Interesting, going down, not rising and coming up. Why would David make that point there? He apparently knew some things that a lot of people today don't know. Psalms 104:19 exposes a solar-lunar calendar. The two great lights, as mentioned in Genesis 1:14. And in verse 16, yes, the stars also. So big question mark about the stars and their role. What is their role regarding that? And regarding star constellations as listed in Job, let me return to that real quickly here, just real briefly, and look at those verses again. Hypothetically, let me propose to you, if our Creator was speaking to Job, and I'm not saying he was speaking to Jobs, like Steve Jobs, maybe he did at the end of his life, but I don't know so much about Steve Jobs in this regard, but Job, we can see that God, our Creator, was humbling Job. What's the big picture of the context? Not to prove Moedim or feasts. He's trying to humble Job. He's humbling him. So as a hypothetical illustration, let me give you a hypothetical illustration simply to express my understanding of this chapter and this verse in context. What if the Big Dipper was listed or replaced in these star constellations in Job? Chapter 38, verses 31 through 33. And let's look at the quote here. Please look at it with me with an open mind without getting offended here. It says, your Creator says, can you bind the cluster of, let's say it was the Big Dipper, hypothetically, or loose the hand of the Big Dipper, or it says belt of that constellation of the Big Dipper, of Orion, as it says there. But let's just say it was the Big Dipper. What would that prove for the holy sacred calendar Moedim? Of course, it wouldn't prove anything, right? He's simply humbling Job. Where were you when all this? You have no power to do this. Can you bring out the Mazzaroth? Or let's say, can you bring out the Big Dipper in its season? Because the Big Dipper isn't around. We don't see it in the sky all year round, right? In the same exact place. It moves around. So can you move it? Of course, Job had no power to do that. Or can you guide the Big Dipper with its handle? Or say the Big Bear with its cubs, or the Big Dipper with its handle? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion on the earth? And again, in context, Yah is simply speaking to Job. Men have no such power. Humans have no such authority to give them dominion over the earth. That's really what it says there. And so why read too much into it to try to connect this to Moedim? Again, the word seasons there isn't Moedim. It's a different Hebrew word. And so there's a lot of inserts in here that are not really in here by some people out there. And I certainly pray and hope that they can see that, especially if they're watching this video, that they won't get offended and have any hatred or bitterness towards me for exposing this in this way. And there is much more that can be expounded upon, as I mentioned earlier, within the biblical Hebrew of the Torah and the Tanakh regarding lights in the firmament. And I want to save that for a future video teaching in the very near future regarding the sun, moon, and stars for Moed, or plural, Moedim. And so we have to understand this Hebrew word techufah. Techufah, again, that's the Strong's number, Hebrew number 8622. There's 4 places it's found in the scripture of the Tanakh. So please stay tuned and interested in a near future upcoming video teaching where I will expound upon this Hebrew word techufah. And I'll probably title it something like When Each Torah New Year Begins.